Alien girl drags human out of a sandstorm, but human finds a locket with her future beside him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Jake Matthews had seen his share of harsh environments during his time as a firefighter, but nothing could prepare him for the merciless sandstorm that was now raging around him. The planet of Terra 7, a barren world on the outer edge of the galaxy, was no place for a human to get lost. The winds howled like a living creature, whipping fine sand into his face, and the temperature dropped quickly as the sun dipped below the horizon. Jake squinted, trying to make sense of his surroundings through the thick veil of dust. His vision blurred as he stumbled through the storm, his breathing heavy, chest tightening with each step. His head spun with dizziness, and exhaustion settled deep in his bones. Just as he was beginning to doubt his chances of survival, a figure appeared out of the storm, a tall, imposing silhouette moving gracefully through the chaos. It was an alien, a woman whose skin shimmered a radiant shade of turquoise, glowing faintly against the harsh backdrop. She moved effortlessly, as if the storm posed no threat to her, her large eyes locked onto Jake with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the haze. Before Jake could react, she reached out and grabbed his arm, pulling him toward her with a strength that took him by surprise. "Come with me," she commanded, her voice calm but firm. Her alien presence, though intimidating, exuded an air of authority that left Jake no choice but to follow. The alien woman, whose name was Seraphina, dragged him through the storm with surprising ease. Her skin radiated warmth, and for the first time since landing on Terra 7, Jake felt heat seep into his chilled limbs. She moved like a force of nature, her every step precise, like she had done this 100 times before. As the storm raged around them, Jake could feel himself growing weaker, his vision blurring again, but Seraphina never faltered. She didn't speak again, but her determination was clear. She knew exactly where she was going, and Jake had no choice but to trust her. The pair pressed on for what felt like hours, though Jake could hardly tell with the storm obscuring everything around them. Finally, they reached a small cave tucked against the side of a jagged rock formation. Seraphina pulled Jake inside, and the moment they were out of the storm's fury, he collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. Seraphina didn't give him a moment's rest. She immediately began tending to him, pulling out a small first aid kit from her pack and expertly bandaging the cuts and scrapes Jake had sustained during his trek. As she worked, Jake couldn't help but watch her. She was unlike anything he had ever seen. Her alien features were sharp and regal, her movements fluid and precise, yet there was a gentleness in the way she handled him. Jake's mind was spinning. He had no idea who this woman was, or why she had saved him, but in that moment, none of it mattered. He could feel himself slipping into unconsciousness, but before everything went dark, he noticed something glinting in Seraphina's hand. It was a small, ornate locket, its surface intricately designed with symbols he didn't recognize. She must have noticed his gaze because she held it out to him, her eyes softening as she did. Without saying a word, she opened the locket, revealing a small, faded picture inside. It was a photo of her. Only, this time, she wasn't the woman before him. In the image, she was standing beside a man and a child, all three smiling. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he realized the woman in the photo was not the same as the one before him. He looked up at Seraphina, who was now staring at him with an unreadable expression. There was something deeply personal about that photo, something she wasn't ready to explain, but it was enough to stir a deep curiosity in him. What did the locket mean? What was her future, and how did he fit into it? But before he could ask, Seraphina stood, closing the locket and slipping it back into her pocket. "Rest," she said, softly, her voice filled with a strange warmth. "We'll talk tomorrow." And with that, Jake closed his eyes, his mind racing with questions, but his body too tired to stay awake. He had survived the storm, but in doing so, he had uncovered a mystery that would change everything he knew about this alien world and about her. As Jake drifted in and out of consciousness, The coolness of the cave and the warmth of Seraphina's presence began to blend together in his exhausted mind. The rhythmic sound of her movements, the soft glow of her skin, and the soothing silence that filled the cave made him feel oddly safe. When he finally woke, it was to the soft hum of a fire crackling nearby. His body still ached, but the pain had dulled. For the first time since landing on Terra 7, he felt somewhat at peace. Seraphina was sitting beside the fire, her eyes focused on the flames, her expression distant. The locket from earlier still weighed on Jake's mind. But now there was a new question. Why had she helped him? Why had she saved him from the storm? Slowly, he pushed himself up, his muscles protesting as he moved. "You're awake," Seraphina said, her voice gentle but firm. She didn't turn to face him, her eyes still locked on the fire. Jake rubbed his face, feeling the exhaustion in his bones. "I thought I was done for," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "You didn't have to help me." "I didn't do it because I had to," Seraphina replied, her voice softening as she finally looked at him. "You were dying out there. It's as simple as that." Her words struck Jake deeply, more than he had expected. The compassion in her voice was genuine, and for the first time, he saw a side of her that wasn't just the warrior who had dragged him from the storm. She wasn't some distant, cold figure. She was real. She was human in a way that he hadn't anticipated. Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I owe you," he said quietly. "I don't know how to repay you." Seraphina gave him a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "But I do need something from you." Jake tilted his head, intrigued. "What do you need?" She stood up, her movements fluid and graceful, like the storm hadn't even touched her. "I need to know if you're going to stay or leave," she said, her gaze steady and unwavering. "This planet isn't safe for humans. I can't protect you forever." Jake stared at her, his mind racing. What she said made sense, but it didn't sit well with him. "And if I stay?" he asked cautiously. Seraphina looked away for a moment, her gaze drifting to the distant horizon outside the cave. "Then you'll have to decide if you want to be a part of something bigger, something you might not understand yet." Her words hung in the air between them, thick with meaning. Jake felt a flicker of something in his chest, a pull, a curiosity he hadn't anticipated. "What is it that I don't understand?" Seraphina met his gaze again, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. Was it sadness? Longing? "You'll see," she said softly. In time, Jake could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He was far from home, lost in a foreign world, and now he was faced with a choice. But what was it that called to him? What was it that made him feel like he needed to stay? As Seraphina turned back to the fire, Jake watched her for a long moment, trying to piece together the puzzle of this alien world, and of the mysterious woman who had saved his life. He didn't have the answers yet, but he knew one thing for sure. There was more to Seraphina than met the eye, and he couldn't leave without discovering the truth about her, about what she was hiding, and why the locket was so important. He had no idea where this path would take him, but for the first time since crashing on Terra 7, Jake felt like he had a purpose. And that purpose, he realized, was tied to her. Days passed as Jake settled into the strange, quiet rhythm of life on Terra 7. The dust storm had subsided, leaving behind a hauntingly still desert landscape. Seraphina remained a constant presence by his side, her unwavering calmness in stark contrast to the chaotic world outside. Jake had started to train himself to survive in the harsh conditions of the planet, learning from her how to navigate its dangers. The more time he spent with her, the more questions he had. What was her purpose here? What was it that made her so different from other beings he had encountered? She wasn't just a warrior, not just someone tasked with protecting him. There was something more to her, something he couldn't quite grasp. Yet, every time he thought he was close to understanding, Seraphina would retreat into herself, leaving him with nothing but fleeting glimpses of the truth. One evening, as the two of them sat by a small campfire in the shelter of the cave, Jake tried again. He had to know more, even if it meant facing the truths he wasn't ready for. "Seraphina," he began, his voice low, the sound of the crackling fire filling the silence between them. "What's in the locket? You don't have to tell me everything, but it feels like it's important." She didn't immediately respond. Instead, she stared into the flames, her features unreadable. The wind outside howled faintly, but here, in the safety of their shelter, it was almost peaceful. Jake waited, his gaze fixed on her. Finally, she turned to him, her eyes softer than before, as if she were deciding whether to trust him with more than just her strength. "It's not just a locket," she said quietly, her voice betraying a hint of emotion. "It's a symbol of my past and my future." Jake didn't know what to say to that. He could see how much it meant to her, but there was more she wasn't saying. The way she spoke, the weight in her voice, it was clear this wasn't just about some piece of jewelry. "You said I would understand in time," he said, trying to keep his tone gentle. "But I don't. I need to know more. I need to know what's really going on." Serafina's eyes flickered with something. Was it fear? Regret? She took a deep breath and shifted closer to the fire, her hands folding in her lap. "There's no easy way to explain this," she said softly. "But you have to understand. I wasn't always alone. My people, my family, they're gone." Jake's heart clenched at her words. She had spoken before of a past filled with pain, but hearing it like this, in the quiet of the night, made it feel more real. She wasn't just an alien warrior. She was someone who had lost everything, just like him in some ways. "The locket holds the memory of my family, the people I loved. It's all I have left of them." Her words were raw, and Jake could feel the weight of her grief, even if he didn't fully understand it. "I've been alone for so long, Jake. This planet, it took everything from me." The silence between them stretched as Jake processed her words. The quiet desert outside felt vast and empty, and yet in this small cave, with Serafina, Jake felt a connection that was unlike anything he had experienced. "I don't know how to fix what's broken," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe you can help me find something worth fighting for again." Jake nodded slowly, understanding more than he had before. She had been through so much, and yet here she was, still standing, still fighting. There was strength in her, but also vulnerability. She wasn't the warrior she appeared to be. She was someone who had been shaped by loss, just like him. "I'll stay," Jake said, his voice firm. "I don't know what the future holds, but I'm not leaving you alone." Serafina's eyes softened, and for the first time in days, she gave him a small, genuine smile. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the wind outside. The fire crackled between them, and in that moment, Jake knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Days turned into weeks, and Jake and Serafina continued their uneasy coexistence on Terra 7. The harsh desert winds had become a familiar backdrop to their daily lives. Jake had learned how to survive in this alien world, with Serafina guiding him every step of the way. He had adapted to the endless expanse of sand dunes and rocky landscapes, learning how to navigate and find shelter. But despite the endless survival training, it was the quiet moments with Serafina that kept him awake at night, pondering the deeper mysteries of their situation. They had formed a routine. He would gather supplies, and Serafina would train him in combat and survival skills. But every evening, as they sat by the fire, the silence between them spoke volumes. Serafina was still distant, keeping her past locked away behind guarded walls. Jake had tried asking more about her, about the people she had lost, but each time, she deflected with a quiet smile or a change of subject. One evening, as the two sat around a fire, Jake found himself staring at the locket again. It had become an unspoken symbol between them, her past, her pain, her reason for fighting. He had no idea what it contained, but something inside him urged him to understand. He couldn't shake the feeling that the key to their future was hidden somewhere in that small, delicate object. "Serafina," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying a sense of urgency he hadn't felt before. "I need to know more about the locket. What does it really mean to you?" Serafina glanced at him, her expression unreadable. She had grown used to his questions, but there was a hesitance in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She sighed deeply, as though weighing her options. "Jake," she began, her voice low, "the locket is all I have left of my family. They were taken from me long ago, and it's the only thing that connects me to them, to my past." Her words were heavy, and for the first time, Jake saw the cracks in her strong exterior. She was more than just the warrior he had come to know. She was someone who had loved and lost. He could see it in the way her hands trembled slightly as she held the locket. "I don't know what to say," Jake whispered. "I can't imagine losing everything like that." Serafina nodded, her eyes distant once again. "You don't have to," she replied softly. But I need you to understand that I carry the weight of their loss with me every day. And that weight affects everything I do. Everything I am. The fire crackled between them, the flames casting dancing shadows on their faces. For a moment, Jake was at a loss for words. How could he understand the depth of her pain? How could he even begin to fathom the weight she carried? But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to leave her to carry it alone. You don't have to carry it by yourself, Jake said, his voice firm. I'm here. We'll figure this out together. Serafina looked at him, her eyes softening for a moment. Before she turned away, her expression clouding once again. I don't want to drag you into this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't know what it's like to lose everything. Maybe not, Jake said, his voice steady. But I know what it's like to feel like there's nothing left. And I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to face this alone. There was a long silence between them, the air thick with unspoken words. Finally, Serafina stood up, her face hardening once more. I didn't ask for this, she said, her voice sharp. But I appreciate what you're saying. Just don't forget that we're not the same. I have my mission, and you have yours. Jake nodded, understanding the boundaries she was setting, but inside, he knew something had shifted between them. There was a connection now, something deeper than survival, something more personal. I won't forget, he said quietly. But I'm not going anywhere. As the night deepened and the fire burned low, Jake couldn't help but feel that they were standing on the edge of something that could change everything. They were both lost in this alien world, but perhaps together, they could find a way back to what they had lost. The winds howled outside, but for once, Jake didn't feel so alone. The days continued to blur together for Jake as he grew more accustomed to life on Terra 7. His body had finally adjusted to the harsh conditions of the planet, and though the landscape remained as unforgiving as ever, his sense of purpose had deepened. He had come to accept that his survival here depended on more than just physical strength. It required trust, and for the first time since landing, he felt like he was starting to trust Serafina. Their bond had grown over the weeks, each shared glance, each quiet conversation adding another layer to the fragile connection they were building. Yet, despite this closeness, there was still a distance between them. It was the unspoken history that hung heavy in the air, the loss that Serafina carried, and the unshed tears that Jake knew she still kept hidden. One evening, as the two of them sat atop a ridge overlooking the endless desert below, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. He had been thinking about their journey, how it had started with nothing but survival, but now it felt like something more. They were no longer just two strangers trying to make it through. There was something else here, something deeper, something that called to him, though he couldn't quite place it. He glanced over at Serafina, who was staring into the horizon, her expression unreadable. Her gaze was distant, but for the first time, there was a flicker of something more, vulnerability. Serafina, Jake said, his voice softer than usual, we've been through a lot together. I know we don't talk about it much, but we can't keep pretending everything's fine. Serafina didn't respond immediately. She simply sat there, her back straight, her posture as unyielding as the planet around them. The silence stretched, and Jake wondered if she would even acknowledge him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. I don't expect you to understand, she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that only Jake could sense. But I can't afford to feel too much. If I let myself feel, I'll never survive. Her words cut through the air like a cold wind. Jake wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but he knew better than to force it. He had learned that much about her. You don't have to go through this alone, Serafina, he said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. You don't have to shut me out. She turned to him, her expression softening just slightly. For the briefest moment, Jake saw the cracks in her armor, the fleeting glimpse of a person who had been broken but was slowly learning to heal. I've been alone for so long, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to trust anyone anymore. Jake nodded, understanding more than she knew. He had felt that way too, especially after everything that had happened back on Earth. But here, on Terra 7, in this strange and unforgiving world, he had found something he hadn't expected. Hope. Hope in Serafina. Hope in the possibility of a future. I'm not asking you to trust me all at once, Jake said. But we can take it one step at a time. Together. Serafina didn't say anything, but for the first time, Jake saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a sign that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to let go of the wall she had built around herself. The moment lingered between them, and Jake felt the weight of it settle into his chest. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about finding something worth living for. As the stars began to emerge in the dark sky above them, the silence between Jake and Serafina felt different. It was no longer filled with tension or fear, but with a quiet understanding. For the first time, they weren't just surviving, they were living together. The days continued to stretch out, and Jake and Serafina found themselves slipping into an unspoken routine. The harshness of Terra 7 was no less brutal, but their bond had grown, and with it, a quiet understanding. They were no longer just two survivors in a foreign world. They had become partners, companions in this strange, hostile environment. Jake had learned the ways of the desert, mastering the art of navigating the endless dunes and avoiding the planet's deadly creatures. But as time passed, his thoughts often drifted back to Serafina, to the things she had shared with him and the things she hadn't. She was still guarded, her walls standing firm, but there were moments, fleeting moments, when Jake could see the person beneath. One morning, after a night spent under the stars, Jake woke to find Serafina standing by the edge of their camp, looking out at the horizon. The early light was just beginning to filter through the clouds, casting the desert in a pale glow. Jake stood up, stretching his stiff muscles, and walked over to her. "You awake already?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. Serafina didn't answer at first. She simply stood there, her silhouette framed by the rising sun, her posture as solid as the rocks surrounding them. After a moment, she spoke. "The wind's picking up," she said quietly. "It's going to be a long day." Jake glanced at the sky. He could feel the air shifting, the pressure in his chest tightening. He had learned to read the desert's subtle signs, and something told him that the storm Serafina was speaking of would be different. "We should head out early then," he said, his tone more serious now. Serafina nodded, but as she turned to gather their things, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had been with Serafina long enough to know when she was holding something back. She was distant again, her mind somewhere else. As they packed up their camp, Jake watched her, his gaze lingering on her movements. There was a tension in the air, something unspoken but palpable. They had been growing closer, yes, but Serafina was still a mystery, and Jake had a feeling that today, he might finally get a glimpse behind her walls. They set off into the desert as the storm clouds gathered overhead. The wind picked up, whipping the sand around them in fierce gusts. Serafina led the way, her pace steady, though Jake could see the slight tightness in her shoulders, the way her jaw clenched with every step. He followed closely, trying to keep up with her pace. After a few hours, they came upon a small ridge, a natural outcropping that provided some shelter from the wind. As they stopped to rest, Jake couldn't hold it in anymore. "Serafina," he began, his voice softer than before. "I know something's on your mind. What's going on?" She looked at him, her eyes momentarily softening, before she quickly turned away. She didn't speak at first, but he could see the battle in her expression. After a long silence, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep doing this," she said, the words heavy with unspoken meaning. Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Doing what?" he asked, unsure if he really wanted to hear the answer. Serafina let out a long breath, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Pretending I'm okay," she said. "Pretending that I don't have this weight on my shoulders. I can't keep running from it, Jake. I can't keep shutting it out." Jake stepped closer, his heart aching at the rawness in her voice. He reached out, gently placing a hand on her arm. "You don't have to do this alone," he said softly. Serafina's eyes flickered to his, a mix of surprise and something else, something deeper. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the weight of everything they had been through together was finally breaking through the walls she had built around herself. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered, her voice filled with vulnerability. "I don't know how to heal." Jake squeezed her arm gently, offering her the only thing he could, his support. "You don't have to have all the answers," he said. "You don't have to fix anything. We'll figure this out together." She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and for the first time in a long while, there was a flicker of something. Hope, perhaps, or at least the possibility of it in her eyes. The storm was coming, But for the first time, Jake didn't feel afraid. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The storm hit just as Seraphina and Jake reached a small valley, a natural shelter nestled between two rocky outcrops. The wind howled with ferocity, pushing them back toward the safety of the narrow gap. Sand stung Jake's face, and the air grew colder, sharper with each gust. He pulled his cloak tighter around him, glancing at Seraphina. She was moving with purpose, as though the storm was just another minor inconvenience in her life. For a moment, Jake felt a wave of admiration for her resilience. He followed her lead, his steps slower, more cautious, as they navigated their way through the treacherous terrain. The storm raged around them, and yet Seraphina seemed unfazed, her movements as fluid and sure as ever. "We need to keep moving," she called over her shoulder, her voice barely audible over the noise of the wind. "We can't stay here long." Jake nodded, pulling himself out of the momentary daze. Despite the storm, there was a sense of calm that had settled over him. He wasn't scared, not anymore. For the first time since arriving on this planet, he felt truly connected to Seraphina. She was not just his savior or his guide, she was something more. He had realized that during their time together, but it wasn't until now, as the storm raged around them, that he fully understood what that more was. She had become a part of him, a presence he couldn't ignore. He trusted her completely. They continued their trek through the valley, the storm battering them, but Seraphina never faltered. Her steps remained steady, her focus unwavering. The wind howled around them, but they pressed on, their bodies working in sync. It was clear now that Seraphina was not just a warrior, she was a survivor. She had been through so much, and yet here she was, leading Jake through this storm as if it were nothing more than a nuisance. After what felt like hours, they finally found a small cave, hidden in the side of a rock formation. It was barely big enough for both of them to fit, but it offered some shelter from the brutal storm outside. Seraphina was the first to enter, crouching down in the darkness, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. Jake followed, his heart pounding from the exertion of the journey. The storm outside continued to howl, but inside the cave, it was silent. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They sat in the darkness, catching their breath. Jake leaned against the cold stone, his body aching from the journey. The storm raged on outside, but in the cave, it was peaceful. "We should rest," Seraphina said softly, her voice the only sound in the quiet. Jake nodded, but he wasn't tired. Not in the way he had been before. There was something different now, something that had shifted between them. He looked at her, her face illuminated by the faint light coming from outside. She looked vulnerable in that moment, something he had never seen before. "Seraphina," he began, his voice low, "why did you save me?" She turned to him, her eyes narrowing slightly, but there was no anger in them. Instead, there was something deeper, something more complicated. "Because I had to," she replied simply. "You weren't just a stranger to me. You were someone who needed help, and I couldn't leave you to die." Jake's chest tightened at her words. There was more there, he could feel it, but he didn't push her. Not yet. Instead, he leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the quiet of the cave wash over him. The storm outside still raged, but for now, they were safe. And in that moment, with Seraphina beside him, Jake knew that whatever came next, he was ready. Together, they could face it all. The following morning, Jake awoke to the sound of the wind still howling outside the cave, but the storm had finally begun to subside. The air was thick with dust, and the ground beneath them was covered in the remnants of the sandstorm, leaving everything with a muted, otherworldly glow. He sat up, stretching his stiff muscles, and glanced over at Seraphina. She was already awake, crouching near the entrance of the cave, her eyes scanning the horizon. Her posture was alert, as always, but there was something different about her today. She seemed more at ease, the tension that had plagued her for weeks now replaced with something calmer, more focused. Jake slowly stood, moving toward her. "Morning," he said quietly. Seraphina turned to him, offering a small nod. "Morning," she replied, her voice steady but soft. There was no trace of the guarded woman he had come to know over the past few weeks. Something had changed in the way she carried herself, and Jake couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. "The storm's over," Jake observed, stepping up beside her. "It looks like it's going to be clear for a while." Seraphina nodded again, but her eyes remained fixed on the distance. We still need to move. There's a settlement about 2 days' walk from here. We should get there before nightfall. Jake felt a pang of unease. He had learned to trust Seraphina's instincts, but something about this next step felt different. The idea of reaching the settlement sounded like a new chapter, one that could hold more answers, or more questions. Do you ever think about what's next? Jake asked cautiously. Seraphina glanced at him, a slight frown forming on her face. What do you mean? I mean, after all this, Jake said, gesturing vaguely to the harsh desert around them. What happens after we get to this settlement? What's the plan? Seraphina stood up straight, finally turning to face him fully. Her expression was unreadable, but Jake could see the conflict in her eyes. I don't have a plan, Jake, she said, her voice firm yet tinged with a hint of frustration. I didn't expect to be here, and I didn't expect you to be with me. But we're both alive, and that's all I know right now. Jake nodded slowly. He wasn't sure what kind of answer he had expected, but this one, though simple, made sense. They had no plan, no clear future, but they were surviving. And that was enough. All right, Jake said after a moment. Then let's get to the settlement. Seraphina gave him a small, approving smile before turning back to the horizon. Let's go. The two of them gathered their things and set out once more, moving through the quiet landscape as the sun rose higher. The desert, though unforgiving, felt less oppressive now. With each step, Jake felt a growing sense of purpose, not just in surviving, but in the journey they were on together. They walked in silence for hours, the vastness of the desert stretching out before them, the world around them feeling as isolated as ever. But Jake no longer felt alone. Seraphina was beside him, her presence, a steady reminder that they were in this together. By midday, the heat had become intense, the air shimmering in the distance. They stopped for a brief rest under a large rock formation, the shade offering some relief from the scorching sun. As Jake took a swig of water from his canteen, he noticed Seraphina watching him with a thoughtful expression. What is it? Jake asked, wiping his mouth. Nothing, Seraphina replied quickly, looking away. Just thinking. Jake didn't press her further. He had learned that Seraphina's thoughts weren't always easy to share, and he respected that. They both had their own battles to fight, their own fears to face. But in this moment, as they sat in the shade together, Jake felt a quiet connection growing between them. It wasn't just about surviving the desert anymore. It was about something more, something that felt real. They had a future ahead of them, uncertain and fraught with challenges, but they would face it together. And that, Jake realized, was enough to keep moving forward. The journey to the settlement had been long, but it was clear that Seraphina and Jake were growing closer, even in their silence. With every step they took through the unforgiving desert, Jake felt more certain that this was where he was supposed to be. The planet, with all its harshness and dangers, was beginning to feel less like a prison and more like a place where he could start over. They had made it through so much already, and the idea of a future, whatever it might look like, seemed within reach. As they approached the settlement by the end of the second day, the landscape began to change. The endless dunes of sand were replaced with sparse vegetation, and in the distance, Jake could make out the faint outline of structures. The settlement was small, a collection of sturdy buildings made from local stone and metal, blending into the desert landscape as though it had always been there. Seraphina quickened her pace, and Jake followed, both of them eager to reach shelter from the scorching heat. As they entered the settlement, the sounds of life began to fill the air. People moved through the narrow streets, going about their business, but there was a quiet tension that Jake couldn't ignore. It was as though everyone here was constantly on edge, always watching. Seraphina led him to a small building near the center, its windows curtained with a fabric that looked both ancient and worn. She knocked softly, and after a moment, the door creaked open. Inside, an older man stood, his face weathered with age but sharp with intelligence. His clothes were simple, though his posture suggested he was someone of importance. Seraphina, he said, his voice low but filled with recognition. I wasn't expecting you so soon. Seraphina nodded. I had to get him here, she replied, her tone more serious than Jake had heard before. The man's gaze shifted to Jake, appraising him with an intensity that made Jake feel like he was being weighed. After a long moment, the man stepped aside. Come in, he said. As they entered, Jake immediately noticed the warmth of the room compared to the chill outside. The interior was sparse but comfortable, with shelves of books and strange devices scattered about. It had the feel of a place that was both lived in and well-maintained, though it was clear the owner of this space was not one for luxury. "This is Eli," Seraphina said, her voice softer now. "He's the one who can help us." Jake nodded, though he wasn't sure what kind of help he was expecting. Eli was silent for a moment, his piercing gaze fixed on Jake. "You've traveled far," Eli said finally. "You're not the first to seek refuge here, but something tells me you're not just running from the storms of this planet." Jake shifted uncomfortably under the man's stare. "I'm looking for answers," Jake said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty he felt. "I don't know what to expect, but I have to find out what happened to me, to us." Eli's eyes softened slightly. "Everyone who comes here is searching for something," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "But the answers you seek may not be what you expect." Jake felt a shiver run down his spine, but before he could ask what Eli meant, Seraphina stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "We're not here for just answers," she said. "We need protection. We need something to help us fight back." Eli nodded slowly, his fingers drumming lightly on the surface of a nearby table. "The world you've stepped into, Jake, is far more complicated than you realize," he said. "But I will help you. For a price." Jake didn't hesitate. "What do you need?" Eli smiled faintly. "Information. Help with a few things that have been bothering me around here." Jake looked at Seraphina, who gave him a small nod, and then back at Eli. "You have a deal," Jake said, not entirely sure what he was agreeing to, but trusting that they would figure it out together. Eli's eyes twinkled with a quiet amusement, but he said nothing further. "Then let's get to work," he said, turning toward the back of the room where another door led deeper into the building. As Jake followed, he couldn't shake the feeling that this settlement was only the beginning of something far more intricate than he had imagined. Whatever answers they were seeking, they were about to step into a world where trust was as fragile as the planet itself, and every decision they made would have consequences. He had come here for answers, but it seemed the answers would come with a price far steeper than he had ever expected.